Thank you for your dedication to the fight against the Trump-Musk ongoing attack on students, workers, and their families, civil rights. We've seen this administration attack diversity, equity, and inclusion, and accessibility in the federal government, and by extension in schools, workplaces, and public services and research, attacks on civil rights that we haven't seen since the 1960s. DEI, regrettably, has been attacked by Republicans in this administration to erase contributions and accomplishments of so many Americans. We've seen the administration remove references to Jackie Robinson, his military participation, references to women in healthcare research or women who served in the CIA have been erased. References to the plane which carried the first nuclear bomb in World War II, the Enola Gay, because artificial intelligence flagged it as a reference to the LGBTQ community, so they wanted that erased along with everything else. Now they're attempted to rewrite history in the latest executive order targeting the Smithsonian Institute. Specifically, the executive order singles out African American History Museum for its corrosive ideology. Before these relatively recent attacks, diversity itself had been the goal. In fact, the Brown v. Board of Education decision in 1954 said that segregation of children in public schools solely on the basis of race denies the children of the minority group of equal education opportunities, even though the physical facilities and tangible factors may be equal. Regrettably, President Trump, during his last administration, appointed dozens of judges who, during their confirmation hearings, refused to say whether Brown v. Board of Education was properly decided. Last week, the President signed an executive order to dismantle the Department of Education, the department which was created to ensure students' civil rights were protected. The department actually does very little in education. Most of its work is civil rights, guaranteeing rights of low-income students. Title I of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, money in low-income areas to offset the effect of funding education with the real estate tax, guaranteeing low-income areas will have to be at a disadvantage, put money in Title I. For some low-income students, racial minorities, dealing with achievement gaps, English as a second language, students with disabilities. Of higher education, we deal with access, Pell Grants, student loans, and some of the proponents of elimination of the Department of Education campaign on the slogan of states' rights. We remember that campaign was used in the 1960s for those who wanted to maintain segregation. The Trump administration's war on diversity, equity, and inclusion programs are not just limited to education. It prompted a purge of federal agencies of employees who supported DEI initiatives, culminating in the unprecedented firing of the EEOC commissioners. Without their presidents, EEOC actually lacks a quorum and is essentially unable to protect the rights of workers whose rights under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act have been violated. Similarly, President Trump has rescinded Executive Order 11246, which has been the cornerstone of civil rights protections in federal contracting since the 1960s. This executive order ensures that federal contractors must take affirmative action to ensure that they are not discriminating against workers based on race, color, religion, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, or national origin. These actions ensured that taxpayer dollars were not being used to fund discrimination. But despite the president's reckless actions and acquiescence of congressional Republicans, we need to assure the public that many are still fighting for diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. Now, this is not just a fight in Congress. This is why we've asked organizations here today to remind us why civil rights are needed to be protected and to tell us specifically what they're doing to combat those attacks. Now, let's be clear. We're not here to do what I call celebrate the problem. We know what this administration has done, and we know what the administration is doing. We want to let the public know what we are specifically doing to fight back and know how the public can join into that fight. So it's my pleasure to turn it over the program to Sam Fullwood, a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, policy analyst, and author, who will moderate today's discussion. Sam, thank you.
Thank you, Representative Scott. I took note of the last thing you said, which was we're not here to celebrate the problem. Based on the group of people that are sitting to my immediate right, they understand what the problem is, and they are working to combat the problem. And I'm eager to hear what they have to say about potential solutions. We're in Congress, and it's one of the functions that I understand from Congress is that it collects information to be able to make decisions. And I think that's the purpose of this meeting, is to collect information so that it can be shared in Congress. It's a perilous time because if you were here, you probably have, I would say, the right ideology about what needs to be done, but not necessarily the right number of votes. And that necessarily means that the public has to be informed and engaged in what's happening. And so I am going to stop talking and listen to what these very smart activist people have to say and what they're doing. Let me introduce who is on our panel. To my immediate right, Amalia Smirnotopoulos is the Senior Policy Counsel and co-manager of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund's Equal Protection Initiative. Prior to joining LDF, Amalia was the Judiciary Counsel and Legislative Director for Senator Sheldon Whitehouse. She began her legal career at the Bronx Defenders, where she was a staff attorney, supervising attorney, and associate legal director in the criminal defense practice. Next to her is Carol Tyson, Government Affairs Liaison with the Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund. She is a Government Affairs which is a national law and policy center. Carol provides an advocate voice in the district and works in coalition with disability and civil rights partners and industry stakeholders, focusing on transportation, equity, health care, supports and services needed to remain in community, education, and civil rights. Prior to joining DREDF, Carol served as the Director, Disability Policy for the United Spinal Association and as a strategic researcher for campaigns in the U.S. and Australian labor movements. Next to her is Shatora Robertson, Senior Policy Counsel, Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. Shatora previously worked in the private sector and served as Chief Diversity Officer for the City of Buffalo, where she developed regional policies for equity and inclusion. Jenna Leventoff is a Senior Policy Counsel at the American Civil Liberties Union, where she develops and advocates for policies related to protecting free speech and promoting robust access to communication tools. Prior to joining the ACLU, Jenna served as a policy counsel at Public Knowledge, advocating for access to affordable, relatable broadband, and was a senior policy analyst for the Workforce Data Quality Campaign at the National Skills Coalition. Wisdom O. Cole is the Senior National Director of Advocacy for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. In his time at the NAACP, he has also acted as the National Director for the NAACP Youth and College Division and the National Campaigns and Training Manager. He has worked on campaigns around the cancellation of student debt, removing police from schools, increasing voter access for young black people, and civil rights advocacy training. Prior to joining the NAACP, Wisdom was a field and state conference organizer for the African Black Coalition. And at the very end of the table, Shawali Patel is the Senior Director of Safe and Inclusive Schools and Senior Counsel at the National Women's Law Center, where she oversees advocacy addressing sex-based harassment in schools and works to strengthen civil rights protections for the LGBTQ plus students and advocate against school censorship and book bans. Previously, she was at the U.S. Department of Education's Office of for Civil Rights, where she worked on policy and guidance interpreting Title IX protections, including schools' responsibilities in responding to sexual harassment, protections for transgender students, and the rights of girls of color. Let's give them a hand for being here. According to our program, each of them is going to tell a little bit about what the work that they're doing, and once they have spoken, I'll have a few questions for them at that point. Let's start with, if we might, with Wisdom, if you might.
Hello, good afternoon. Y'all can hear me? Good. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Congressman Scott, for inviting the NAACP to be here to discuss what is at stake. I appreciate you really pushing us to action, because this is what it's about in this moment in time. We are seeing an aggressive attack on our civil rights that is being masqueraded as this attack on diversity, equity, and inclusion. What is really happening in this moment in time is an attack on our social safety nets, recognizing that there are cuts being happening to Medicare, to Medicaid, to Social Security, to veteran benefits, right? The NAACP being 116 years in advocacy, that is our bread and butter. That is our population. Those are the people that we serve each and every single day across America. And so as we are seeing these distractions unfold, it's important for us to ask these questions about why and what we can ask our constituents to do. Literally as I was coming in this afternoon, talking to our legal counsel about, what are the actual cases that we are filing, what are the lawsuits that we're filing. Just today, right, we joined a lawsuit with the League of Women Voters against Trump in federal court to stop a dangerous and illegal executive order that threatens the right to vote. Today Trump has put an executive order that forces voters to show a passport or citizenship documents to register using federal forms and decertify all state voting machines and override vote-by-mail laws in 18 states. We have to be clear. This is unconstitutional. Right? This is not allowed. You do not have the authority to rewrite election law. That power belongs to Congress and the states. But in addition, right, we're seeing with even in our lawsuits just this weekend, we were able to win, right? There were cuts to the Center for Financial Protection Bureau, which was an agency that I worked hand in hand with around some of our student debt cancellation work in the last 4 years. We were able to see that we were able to win that, right? In addition, we were able to sue the Department of Education, or sue to stop the dismantling of the Department of Education and support legal action that temporarily blocks Trump's executive orders of banning DEI across the federal government. So what does that mean, right? What are we doing with our members? What are we doing to make sure that folks are actively engaged in what's happening? Because there's a lot of distractions happening. So part of what we did at the end of the last election cycle was kick off our 2025, which was an educational campaign to make sure that people understood what was happening and being dismantled by Project 2025. Over the course of the last few months, we've consistently had webinars, educational seminars, town halls, bringing elected officials, bringing experts to understand what is actually happening and make sure that folks understand ways in which they can be active in this fight. Part of what we have to do in this moment in time is really give people in the states power to understand how to make those phone calls, send those emails. To be honest, I think over the last 4 years, we've gotten a little bit lazy with our advocacy. Right? A lot of things were given to us. A lot of things were handed to us. A lot of things were expected of us, right? Now we are asking our members again to pick up those phones, to send those emails, to call your members of Congress and let your voice be heard, right? Part of that, and the way I see it as an advocate, is like, how do we measure our advocacy work each and every single day, right? How are we getting our constituency to be active in this fight and understand the impact that it has on them each and every single day? In addition to that, it's making sure that we are having those in-district visits, right? Making sure that folks have the opportunity to meet with legislators and talk with them one-on-one, right? As you've seen, there have been more and more people coming into D.C., making sure that they are having those meetings, scheduling time, and moving their members. Part of that is also making sure that we are making our voices heard in the street, right? As the former director for youth and college at NAACP, we have young members each and every single day who are working to ensure that their campuses are committed to diversity no matter what. 2 summers ago, we saw the gutting of affirmative action, right? What does that mean in terms of the protection and safety for young people of color in those ivory institutions? Part of that is making sure that these institutions commit to diversity no matter what, making sure that they are ensuring that young people of color are allowed into those universities, are able to help not only survive, but actually truly thrive in these universities with certain protections to ensure that they have access, accommodations, and making sure that they're not being filtered out. I want to turn our attention to a big population that we have within the NAACP, which is veterans, right? We're seeing an aggressive rollback on veteran rights and safety nets, and the NAACP has worked together to bring veterans to consistently have those conversations and ensure what needs to happen next. The last thing I'll say is that the NAACP is working to ensure that as we're seeing these rollback on DEI from a consumer perspective, right? We saw in 2020 commitment from multiple agencies, organizations, companies to diversity no matter what, right? It's not enough just to post those black squares or to donate pennies on the dollar to these organizations. 4 years later, what are you doing to still commit to show up and support these organizations, right? Across America, folks have been doing boycotts. Folks have been doing buy-ins. The NAACP launched a Black Consumer Advisory Pledge Form, which advises Black folks on where they should be spending their dollars, what organizations and companies have committed and still committing to those pledges that they made in 2020. Where should we be buying? How can we buy and support in local Black-owned businesses and communities, right? These are small but simple strategies that we can continue to do over the course of this year and next year to continue to build power. Because what we have to do in this moment in time is truly commit to that diversity no matter what, empower people on the ground to sift between all the noise, right? There's a lot of things that are being thrown at us to confuse us, to make sure that we are consistently spiraling out. But in this moment in time, the more education, the more information, the more opportunities for our members to lift up their voices and to advocate, the more we're able to see power.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to Amalia, and you're going to talk a little bit about education and the work that you all are doing in that area.
Great. Thank you, and thank you to Ranking Member Scott for having me here today. So I think you're going to hear a lot of similar themes from the organizations at this table because we are working closely with each other and with others of the civil rights community to combat against these attacks. Fundamentally, as my colleague Mr. Cole was saying, this is about distraction and it is about division. That is the point. They are trying to distract and divide us in order to attack the fundamental protections against discrimination for Black communities, Latino communities, Asian American communities, women, people with disabilities, LGBTQ plus communities, with that fundamental goal of creating a country where only the wealthy and privileged have access to opportunity. These attacks are not new. And they are not even as recent as that June 2023 decision in Students for Fair Admissions. This is a decades-long organized campaign that began as soon as the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed, designed to take away the protections that were hard fought and won by the civil rights movement, and to return us to a time when racial segregation and other forms of segregation are the norm in this country. And I think having that generational perspective is key in figuring out how to combat the attacks we are seeing today. And at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, we are made for this fight. We have been in existence for 85 years now. We helped litigate Brown versus Board of Education, and we are committed to defending the proper interpretation of the Equal Protection Clause in this country and ensure that equal protection means equal protection for all of us, and that our civil rights laws create equality for all of us. And what that means is we're pursuing efforts on a number of different lanes to combat the attacks that we're seeing. First, we were happy to file a lawsuit with the ACLU challenging the executive order on birthright citizenship, because this is not just an attack on immigrant communities. This is an attack on one of the fundamental pieces of our Constitution. It is seeking to say that the president can rewrite a constitutional provision that guarantees equal citizenship for all of us in this country with the wave of a Sharpie. And because of that, we need to be combating it in order to prevent that erosion of that concept. But we're also fighting the numerous attacks on diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility across this country. We filed a lawsuit with Lambda Legal, representing the National Fair Housing Alliance, the National Urban League, and the AIDS Foundation of Chicago. 3 organizations that accept federal grants and contracts in order to provide critical services to their communities. These are organizations that are working every day to fight housing discrimination and ensure that everyone can access a rental apartment, that they're free from appraisal bias when they're buying a home. These are organizations that are providing workforce training in their communities to ensure that young people have a path to economic opportunity. And they're also providing critical health care to people with significant illnesses. All of that work requires them to actually be able to address the barriers that the populations they're serving face. It requires them to understand how race and gender impact the ability of the people they serve to access the workforce, housing, and healthcare. And because of that, when the administration threatens to cut off their funding, if they do not comply with a vague prohibition on DEI, which is defined nowhere in any of the executive orders that the president has issued, that creates a chilling effect on them and also on the broader community of nonprofits and private sector institutions that are trying to actually adequately serve people in this country. So we were pleased to partner with Lambda Legal in filing that case and are currently awaiting decision on a request for a preliminary injunction that would bar the application of the 2 anti-diversity executive orders as well as the anti-gender executive order on our clients. But that's not all that we're doing. Fundamentally, these executive orders are trying to achieve through vagueness, through the creation of fear, what they can't actually create through law. As we all know, the president cannot actually alter fundamental civil rights protections with the wave of a pen. And so a lot of what we're doing, and I can elaborate a bit on that more on that later, is to really make sure that both private sector employers, state and local governments, nonprofits, higher education institutions, and also pre-K through 12 schools and the parents and students they serve understand what the law is and what these executive orders are not. And I'm happy to talk more about that in a little bit.
Carol, can you talk a little bit about the fight that's being engaged by the disability community and on behalf of Americans with disabilities?
Yes, absolutely. First of all, thank you. It really is an honor to be here with all of you. So I'm going to reference things that are happening in education, workforce, and a little bit on healthcare. And I'll state some problems. I'm not going to celebrate them, but just so I can tell you what we're doing in response. But mostly I want to say at the top that one thing we're doing, and that I would say for DREDF, which is the short way to say it, is we are having to make clear, we're having to figure out and make clear to the rest of the disability community and public where we stand on all of these issues. The disability community is not a monolith. We are huge, and there are people all across the whole political spectrum. As a piece of it is making clear where we are, educating the people that may not be where we are, and hoping that they will join us and that will continue. So I would say that we've always advocated for inclusion and work in coalition with partners seeking to advance the civil and human rights of all people, so not just people with disabilities. We're active members of the Consortium for Constituents with Disabilities and the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, so we try to work in coalition with all of those groups. We believe that their attacks against critical diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility efforts, the attempts to erase transgender and non-binary people, and the targeting and disappearing of immigrants, including students, school employees, and caregivers, harms disabled people and our families. The administration's EO, which was already referenced, ending the requirements for federal contractors and subcontractors to prevent employment discrimination, coincided with ableist and racist comments casting blame on disabled workers and DEIA initiatives for the deadly plane crash at National Airport. DREDF and other disability-led organizations called out the devaluing of disabled employees' lives. The Rehabilitation Act of 1973 still prohibits the federal government from discriminating against people with disabilities and requires accommodations be provided. So DREDF and partners, which were the Bazelon Center for Mental Health Law and the ACLU, have authored and shared a guide for federal workers with disabilities, answering common questions about their rights. We encourage federal workers with disabilities to continue to advocate for their own needs, to file complaints if they feel safe doing so right now, and have provided other actions that can be taken. DREDF is denouncing, it will continue to denounce the attempts to dismantle the Department of Education, the gutting of the offices of civil rights, and the transfer, or the plans to transfer services and supports for disabled students to the Department of Health and Human Services, leaving the enforcement of essential laws like the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, the Rehabilitation Act, and the Americans with Disabilities Act solely to states and localities will result in a negative impact on all students with disabilities, particularly those who are transgender or gender nonconforming, Black, Brown, and Indigenous, and those who live in rural or low-income communities. Students with disabilities have a right under the IDEA to a free and appropriate education and belong in classrooms, not medical institutions or other segregated settings. DREDF is lifting up resources from the CCD and LCCHR and others so that our community, our broad disability community, can learn more about the important role the Department of Education has played and must continue to play. We are urging our community to take action in their schools at the local, state, and federal levels by calling on decision makers to protect the department, the support services, grants, and research it delivers, and access to mainstream education for disabled students. And then I'll just touch on healthcare for a minute. Last week, DREDF joined more than 450 national, state, and local organizations in a letter to congressional leadership expressing it says significant concern, but it's really much more than that, about reported plans to reorganize and close significant departments within HHS. The letter, which was led by the American Association on People with Disabilities, strongly opposed plans to eliminate the Administration for Community Living and split its functions across 3 agencies, as well as the consolidation of the Office for Civil Rights and Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Agency. ACL was created over a dozen years ago to help manage funding and coordination for long-term services and supports across HHS's 28 divisions. And long-term services and supports allow people with disabilities to be in the workforce, to go to school, to be in our communities. ACL has helped to make living in the community a reality for disabled people since its existence, and a similar letter was sent to HHS by members of the Disability and Aging Collaborative. Finally, in February, HHS Office of Civil Rights withdrew gender-affirming care guidance, while the broader HHS issued incorrect guidance regarding the sexes. Transgender and non-binary people are often subject to discrimination in healthcare. Yesterday, DREDF joined other disability advocacy organizations in a statement condemning ableist attacks on access to healthcare for transgender people. Trans people are more likely to have a disability than cisgender people, and like all disabled people, trans disabled people deserve the right to bodily autonomy, self-determination, and equitable access to health care, including gender-affirming care. DREDF will continue to litigate for individuals with disabilities facing discrimination in education and health care, and to advocate for the rights of disabled people through legislation and engaging with the administration when appropriate. And we'll encourage everybody who follows us in the disability community to join with us and take action, and hopefully provide them the courage that they need in this moment. The civil rights laws that we fought so hard for have not changed, and we will not back down. We will remain committed to our mission and in solidarity with the civil rights community, and we seek to remain a partner with everybody in this room. Thank you.
We have been joined by my congressman, Glenn Ivey from Maryland. So I'll pause just a moment. If you want to have a comment to us, I'll be more than...
Well, why don't we just continue the panel?
Perfectly.
I appreciate it, though. Thank you.
Shatora Robertson, can you join us now?
It would be my pleasure. Thank you, Ranking Member Scott, and your wonderful staff for allowing me the opportunity to sit among my distinguished colleagues this afternoon. I'd like to take this opportunity to actually zoom in a little bit, because I'm here to talk about the impact on economics and jobs of the actions that we've seen coming out of this administration. And I'm going to zoom in a little bit because I'm from Buffalo. So pretty American place. I saw a little cheer in the back, go Bills. And so, you know, Buffalo, a lot of people don't know this. There's a lot of black people in Buffalo, about 40%. And Buffalo is one of the most segregated places maybe on the planet, but definitely in this country. And so as a person growing up in Buffalo and having a long career in Buffalo, you realize that opportunity is not something that's given based upon merit. If you are a person of color, especially a black person, if you don't have connections to the right person or the right people, if you don't come from the right family, you have to be quite scrappy to get ahead. And even then, you will not reach the levels of which folks who were born on second, third base do, right? And so when diversity, equity, and inclusion became an actual concept, an actual practice, I had the privilege of being the second chief diversity officer of the city of Buffalo after I left private practice. And in that role, I specifically focused on economics for the black community, because I knew first and foremost that if you give people an economic advantage, opportunity opens up for them in so many ways. And the number one way that that opportunity opens up for people is in their mind. They then begin to believe that they can have access to things. So the first attack that we're seeing with these two DEI executive orders is an attack on our belief that we are able to achieve and to have access to opportunity. And that is being reinforced over and over again, that we do not belong, right? And so being at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law was established in 1963 by a coalition of lawyers that came together, that was brought together by President John F. Kennedy. And that coalition of lawyers was tasked with preserving the civil rights, especially the civil rights for black people. And so it's an honor to be sitting here before you all today to be able to talk about these issues. And it's also an honor to be able to be in this space at this time. Now is not the time. We all know history here. We all know the history of civil rights in this country. And unfortunately, history is repeating itself in a way that we would prefer it to not. But now we have the opportunity to participate in what future generations will look back and be proud of for us doing. And so I'll just say that we at the Lawyers Committee recognize that the policies coming out of this administration through executive and agency actions are regressive, and they are regressive on purpose. These anti-DEI executive orders, they're going to lead to less market competition, unfair workplace policies through the repeal of Executive Order 11246, and set back underrepresented groups, especially the Black community, even further economically. And so at the Lawyers Committee, we are taking action through advocacy, especially in partnership with our coalition partners. We're proud to be members of the National Urban League's Demand Diversity Roundtable. We make sure that our voice is heard through letters to officials, one-on-one meetings, public statements, workshops, and educational materials that you can find on our website. And we're also proud to be leading litigation challenging these unlawful executive orders and the key provisions of their anti-diversity, equity, and inclusion provisions, especially through our lawsuit that's entitled Chicago Women in Trades versus Trump. And so when you think of diversity, equity, and inclusion, unfortunately, corporations co-opted and bastardized what DEI really meant. But what the leaders at Chicago Women in Trades do is what DEI, what diversity, equity, and inclusion was meant to do, which is prepare a new generation of workers and folks in the workplace. This is just one example, to be ready for jobs that are critical and that are needed in our economy. There is no favoritism. There is no leg up. There are no quotas. This is just good policy and good things to do for people who need jobs in an industry that needs workers. Thank you.
Okay. Shawali Patel, you're going to talk about women's issues and Title IX?
Yes. Good afternoon, and thank you, Ranking Member Scott, for inviting me to speak today. I'm Shawali Patel, the Senior Director of Safe and Inclusive Schools at the National Women's Law Center. And NWLC has been a leader on Title IX issues since our founding in 1972, which was the same year that Title IX was enacted. And since then, we have been advocating for gender equity in schools, in workplaces, in healthcare. We have advocated for accessible childcare, for reproductive rights, for income security rights for women. And we do this work while centering low-income women and families, women and girls of color, and LGBTQI+ individuals. And as you've heard from my fellow co-panelists, through recent actions by the Trump administration, we have seen a clear agenda to dismantle longstanding civil rights protections and the very idea that people in this country can go to work and can go to school with safety and dignity. And at NWLC, we are deeply concerned about the Trump administration's ongoing attacks on diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, on civil rights and protections for the trans community. And these attacks threaten the most vulnerable among us and undermine our democracy. They include using trans inclusion as a wedge issue to justify broader attacks on civil rights, fostering harassment, and targeting women who don't conform to traditional gender stereotypes. These include undermining the U.S. Department of Education, limiting its ability to enforce civil rights laws, including Title IX, and also weaponizing federal civil rights laws to launch politicized investigations into school districts and universities that support trans students, while actively making schools less safe for all women and girls by reinstating harmful, DeVos-era 2020 regulations that weaken protections against sexual violence in schools. And they include attacking diversity, equity, inclusion efforts in schools and employment. But in response to these attacks, we are fighting back. We are making clear that trans inclusion is a core gender justice issue, and that attacks on trans women harm all women because fundamentally, they are about punishing those who don't meet an increasingly narrow definition of womanhood. When Trump issued an executive order on the first day of his administration, falsely claiming to, and I quote, defend women, while actually seeking to strip legal protections from trans people, the National Women's Law Center led over 170 gender justice and women's rights advocates to essentially say, not in our name. We know that efforts to narrowly define who is protected under civil rights laws harm all women, particularly Black and brown women, and anyone who doesn't conform to sex-based stereotypes and someone else's idea of femininity. We've also intervened in lawsuits challenging Biden's Title IX rule that were brought by conservative states, groups, and a school district as recently as yesterday to restore Title IX protections against sex-based harassment in schools. This was a rule that was finalized last year in April, a rule that student survivors and educators, civil rights advocates, and institutions were urging the Biden administration to issue. And despite Trump dismissing our complaints of hostile environments created by book bans as I quote, a hoax, we continue to, and we will continue to advocate for students of color and LGBTQI+ students who are harmed by these bans. And we have pushed back against efforts to attack DEI initiatives by urging the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights to rescind harmful guidance misrepresenting the law. And as you heard earlier from my co-panelists at the Lawyers Committee, we are part of the legal team alongside the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, the Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and Latino Justice, proudly representing Chicago women in trades in the lawsuit to challenge Trump's anti-DEI executive orders, which threatens economic opportunities for women. Last week, we led a letter to EEOC Acting Chair Andrea Lucas, alongside several organizations on this panel, condemning her efforts to intimidate law firms into abandoning DEI practices, as well as a recent guidance document that EEOC issued on DEI at her direction. As you've heard from us all, our opponents are coming for us, which makes our unity and resolve at this moment more critical than ever. We stand ready for the fight ahead, and thank you again for inviting us to be on this panel, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. I also want to acknowledge that we also have been joined since we began with by Congresswoman Congresswoman Hayes of Connecticut has joined us. Welcome. Thank you for being with us. Last but not least, Jenna Leventoff is going to talk about the efforts to combat anti-Semitism and free speech.
Thank you so much for having me. To be clear, the ACLU is appalled at President Trump's censorship and intimidation of those of us who are exercising our First Amendment rights, and we're doing everything that we can to stand up for the First Amendment. Universities need to be places where ideas are debated and not where students fear surveillance, fear punishment, fear deportation because they spoke out about their political beliefs. So a lot of the ACLU's work has been focused on stopping the administration's efforts to detain and deport people for no reason besides their protected speech. First, we've made sure that everyone knows their rights when they're protesting on and off campus. We've done 2 trainings for almost 3,000 people. We told attendees ways that they could stay safe when they're protesting, where protests are and aren't legally allowed, what they can do to record law enforcement, and what to do if they're stopped by police. Later this week, we'll make that guidance available to our congressional allies in the hopes that they share it with their constituents as well. We've also distributed model guidance for those in the states of ways they can police protests. The guidance is aimed at reducing police presence at protests, and we expect some of the states in our network to adopt it. On the organizing front, we've been working federally and with our affiliates to protect free speech on campus. After Trump signed an executive order to deport non-citizen student and faculty protesters, we crafted an open letter to universities. We offered support, and we urged them to reject pressure to punish international students and faculty for exercising their First Amendment rights. Additionally, over 22,000 individuals signed our action calling on universities to protect free speech on campus. And of course, we've been working to defend the individuals that have been detained by ICE. So we joined the legal team of Mahmoud Khalil. He's a U.S. green card holder that was detained by ICE in direct retaliation for leading pro-Palestinian protests at Columbia. We're awaiting the determination of the venue of the court case any day now, and after that, we will be seeking his release on bail. To date, over 130,000 people have sent a message to ICE using an ACLU action telling them to release Mr. Khalil. The ACLU and our Massachusetts affiliate also joined the legal team of Ramesa Ozturk. She is a PhD student at Tufts who was detained in apparent retaliation for an op-ed that she wrote. Some of you might have seen the video of her being grabbed and detained by plainclothes officers wearing masks. So far, the only thing that the government has said is that her student visa was revoked, apparently because of her op-ed. I think it's just, I know we're not here to talk, but I think it's worth reiterating. An op-ed is the most protected of free speech. Just period. On Friday, a federal judge barred the administration from removing her from the United States. The government response to her habeas petition and complaint are actually due today, and her bond hearing is set for April 7th. Also, just today, our Virginia affiliate announced that they filed an emergency motion on behalf of Dr. Kansuri. He's a professor at Georgetown, and he was taken into custody, again, by masked federal agents because he spoke out in support of Palestine. He's an Indian national, and he's in the U.S. on a research and professor visa. A federal judge has now ruled that he also can't be removed from the country pending the outcome of our lawsuit. Although the administration appears to be abusing regulation to combat anti-Semitism to target those who are saying something the administration doesn't like, unfortunately, bipartisan members of Congress are trying to enshrine problematic definitions of anti-Semitism into law as we speak. The Anti-Semitism Awareness Act codifies something called the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which confounds protected speech with unlawful discrimination. We've been actively fighting the passage of that bill in Congress because it's more clear now than ever that this legislation will enable the administration to disappear students and teachers because of their protected speech in support of Palestine. We've also joined on different fronts the National Education Association to file a suit against vague legal restrictions that were put forth in a Department of Education Dear Colleague letter. It threatened federal funding cuts for educational institutions that engage in diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. Students and teachers are unsure what they can and can't teach and learn, despite having a First Amendment right to learn about diverse viewpoints. We've been working to protect trans individuals on and off campus. We filed a lawsuit over Trump's policy requiring passports to reflect someone's sex assigned at birth, and a lawsuit over Trump's EO banning access to gender-affirming care for those under the age of 19. After the lawsuit, a district court granted a nationwide preliminary injunction preventing the administration from conditioning, withholding, or terminating federal funding that's based on a healthcare entity or health professional who provides gender-affirming medical care. We've been aggressive in fighting attacks on the advocacy front as well. Just last week, we concluded a campaign that drove over 75,000 public comments to the State Department in opposition of the administration's proposed changes that make it impossible for trans and non-binary people to have accurate passports. And we mobilized to defeat an anti-trans bill in the Senate. The so-called Protection of Women and Girls in Sports Act was intended to ban transgender girls and women from participating in school sports. The ACLU drove over 700 calls into offices and sent over 17,000 text messages, resulting in 300 more calls. All of our targets voted against the legislation. Moving forward, we are committed to educating, advocating, and litigating to protect the civil rights and civil liberties of everyone.
I have questions for each of you that I'm eager to ask, and we won't be able to get to all of them. Time just won't permit. But I do want to begin, if I might, by asking a question and ask each of you to, in your own way, answer the same question, which is that, as I said at the top, we're here in Congress, and you all are working in communities. What would you want Congress to do? What specifically, how should our representatives speak about the work that you're doing? What bills or policies should they adopt to change what's going? Whenever things go awry in this country, people immediately say, I'm going to call my congressperson. So now you have a chance to speak to your congressperson. What are you going to tell them? Yes.
I can start. I think people are afraid to speak out right now. And the administration is doing that intentionally. The administration is going after people that speak out against them, people that say things they don't like. And people are scared. And members of Congress can lead by example. They can speak out to say what's happening is wrong. They can make their constituents feel comfortable exercising their First Amendment rights. I think that showing people that they have support, they aren't alone. We don't want Trump's censorship to work. We want people to stay safe, but those who can speak out absolutely should. So I think just the most helpful thing that members can do right now is what Ranking Member Scott is doing, which is speaking out.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I would also add a couple of additional asks. I think members of Congress need to be educating, supporting, and defending against the attacks that we're seeing. Educating is important because I worry that the many people in this country are still not yet aware of how the anti-diversity executive orders and other attacks on the concept and the value that we hold as Americans in diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility is going to impact all of us. Under the guise of these executive orders, they have cut funding for cancer research, for dementia research, Black maternal health research, workforce development grants, education programs, including teacher training programs. That is going to harm all of us. And the more members can help elevate that message and the stories of the organizations and people that are being impacted, the more I think people will understand what is actually happening right now. 2 is supporting. I think that there are organizations, whether that is your local school district, your college or university, or an employer, that want to continue investing in these programs because they are lawful and they are necessary. But they need to hear more than just from our opponents. The members of Congress need to both call in the organizations that want to continue investing in these programs and call out the organizations that are using these executive orders as a cover to roll back from programs that maybe they were not fully committed to in the first place. And finally, we need members of Congress to defend and hold the line and prevent these programs from becoming law. There are a number of pieces of legislation that have been introduced this Congress that would codify the provisions in these executive orders that seek to dismantle core civil rights policies, such as the Dismantle DEI Act. And we need members of Congress to help us track those pieces of legislation and to oppose them should they ever come into committee or on the floor.
Anyone else?
I can go next. So I would say just building, I didn't actually write this down, but what folks are saying is making me think of this. I have people in terms of Congress really being seen as leaders and being models. I have people in my family who up until the last couple months really had no idea what I did for a living, what I've been doing for a long time now. And all of a sudden now they know. And they are really deeply concerned because what's happening here in my world is impacting their jobs, their Social Security, their all of these things, their clients, all of those things, and they're calling me and we're having discussions I've never had. And I told them, like, please, so I direct them and I say, call your member of Congress, do all these things. I'm just pushing all the things that everybody here is creating, and they're doing it. And then they're sending me the responses every time from their Congress member. And so they really feel like it's a conversation and a relationship that they have with their Congress member. And I'll just say my father wrote his Congress member and said, what do I do? What can I do? So that's what I would ask members of Congress. Please have that conversation. Instead of in your newsletter just telling your constituents what you're doing, tell them what they can do to work with you in partnership. In addition, hold the agencies to task on their responsibility to uphold the laws that we still have in this country, continue to engage the general public, just what I just said, continue to share our stories, and track how these actions are impacting people, students and workers, and track success stories at the local level of how people are pushing back and standing up for their own rights. Thank you.
Anyone else, please?
I'll just say that what we're experiencing is a fundamental lack of civics in this country right now. I recognize that there's only so much each of our representatives can do, but I think I just want to double down on Amalia's point about education. I think the simplest terms that we can use, the most basic messages that we can convey will resonate. We see it resonating in other ways, but how can we do it accurately and with facts and what's actually happening? I don't think people appreciate that their rights are being taken away from them and they're cheering them on, and it's going to be too late. And so when things like the continuing resolution or other major pieces of legislation come up that are absolutely consequential for everyday Americans, I think working together across districts with other members of Congress to convey these messages and put them out there, again, because one representative can't do it all, I think is really going to be helpful to combat the misinformation that's getting out there rapidly.
Is there a language that you think that Congress people should be using to get their message across more clearly?
As few words as possible.
Okay. Yes, I think.
I can jump in next. One of the things that I've been thinking about, we've been thinking about holistically as an association, is there is division in our traditional advocates, right? And so what we're asking for our members of Congress who are here, who support us, who speak out, is to talk to your colleagues, right? Ensure that they are listening and responding to the needs of their constituents, right? I think it's important for us to make sure that constituents know that folks are showing up for us in the face of democracy. Last but not least, I really believe that we need a North Star. What are we trying to accomplish in the next 2 to 4 years? What are the things that we are directing our members, our constituents, our allies to? Is it reconciliation? Is it the 250th anniversary of America? What are we building towards? And I'm speaking from this as a movement advocate, as somebody who knows how to build power. We need a direction that we can get everybody to go all in on, right? What is the thing that we are directing our members towards, that we're directing our people towards, so they can see that this is not for nothing, right? That this is actually building something that can withstand the next attack. And as my colleagues have said, we got to make it plain, right? You know, there's a KISS principle, right? We got to keep it simple. And that happens through storytelling, that happens through town halls, that happens through using messaging on the appropriate platforms and making sure that people understand exactly what's going on. Because right now we're seeing the author of confusion go in on all of us.
Yes.
I think much of what I have to say is going to be, underscoring the important points that have been made on this panel. I think it's so important at this moment for members of Congress to provide the clarity around what's happening, because part of the intention behind the Trump administration's actions is to create this chaos, and out of chaos create fear, right? And so to be very clear about what these actions do or don't do, the unlawfulness of them, and then the steps that Congress can take to combat what is happening is so important at this moment. I also think it's very important that members hold the administration accountable to use every tool in the toolbox, oversight functions, to force the administration to answer for weakening civil rights protections, for dismantling federal government agencies like the Department of Education, for disrupting the lives of thousands of federal workers, and ultimately for dismantling or attempting to dismantle our democracy. And so there are tools that our Congress members have to hold the Trump administration accountable. But again, this sort of, speaking out, education, offering clarity is so needed at this moment. And part of that is to the narrative piece and the storytelling and centering the stories of constituents, of federal workers, of individuals who are the ones who are experiencing harm from the Trump administration's actions is also critical at this moment. So we understand what the impact is. To kind of see beneath the lies that's put out by the administration on what their intention is, and to really showcase what they're actually doing.
I'm also going to pose this for the whole group. I'd originally planned it for just one person, but I'm curious to know what are your organizations, your unique organizations' greatest needs to maintain the sustained fight to preserve civil rights in this era? Do you need legislation? Do you need funding? Do you need partnerships? I know you're going to say yes, but what is the greatest need? It's up for grabs. Any of you can answer it. All of you will.
What can the public, how can the public chime in?
Sure.
No, I mean,
Yes. Yeah.
how can, if somebody wants to do something, what do they do? And I've told them to join your organizations. But how are you enlisting the energy of the public?
Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. The congressman asked, how can the public join what you are doing? He has suggested in his meetings with people that they should get involved with organizations such as these. He now wants to know, what can the public do within your organizations?
Yeah.
How do you sort of incorporate them?
Yeah. So I think we're calling on the public through a number of different ways. One, I would say all of the things that you suggested would be helpful. But in terms of like additional action steps that members of the public can take, I think one of the things that we're thinking a lot about is what we can be doing to mobilize the public to help them support institutions that are feeling chilled right now, that are feeling threatened by the executive orders and other actions by the administration. So, for example, several of my co-panelists mentioned this Dear Colleague letter from the Department of Education, which threatens to take away funding from higher education institutions and pre-K through 12 schools that continue to try to create equal opportunity for students on their campuses as well as for their faculty. And this Dear Colleague letter advances a completely radical and untethered view of the law. But schools are understandably scared because their funding is at stake. And, you know, we can tell them what the law is and what the law is not. We can tell them what Title VI process should look like. But they need to be hearing from the parents and students at those schools about why they still want these programs, about why, you know, having an affinity group that allows them to gather with other Black students helps create an environment where they can thrive academically. Why, you know, taking the step of actually removing a standardized test that wasn't actually evaluating students accurately and making sure that a broader set of students can access educational opportunities made a difference for their kid. And so I think we, through our social media channels and newsletters, are constantly reaching out to the public and suggesting ways that they can be weighing in on these policies at the very local level, where I think people will see impacts if they do that outreach.
So I'll add that I feel overwhelmed with the amount of things to keep up with right now, and it's literally my job. So I can only imagine how the everyday person who's a parent going to school or, you know, picking their kids up from school, going to work, and then has to, you know, clean the kitchen at night, among other things, is trying to keep up. So here's my advice to people who want to know the facts. All of us are putting out information every day. As much as you can, consume your information from sources. Do not consume your information from social media. Those algorithms are manipulated and meant to make you feel emotional. You will find on our website, lawyerscommittee.org, and all of our respective websites, accurate information vetted by experts so that you can have the right information. And then question it. Talk about it with your friends and family. Talk about it with people you disagree with so that you can get your own understanding and come to your own understanding of what is happening right now. It's easy to go on social media and get that information, but when you like something, when you look at it for longer than something else, that algorithm is taking that into account. And so it's only going to feed you things that you're going to keep consuming. And generally, as emotional people, we're going to consume things that make us feel a certain way. The truth is boring. The truth is boring. What's happening, and you know, I've got pages and pages of jargon that I could read you. But what's most important is that you're getting the facts straight from sources.
one of the things that I hold near and dear to me as an organizer, my philosophy when it comes to really everything is local victories inform the national narratives. Local victories inform the national narratives. What does that mean? We have to win on the local level. We have to ensure that folks are joining and being a part of our organizations, right? I can talk about the NAACP. The NAACP practices democracy in the way in which we elect our leaders, in the way we choose the issues we fight for. We have a giant national convention coming up this summer, July 11th through 17th, where members who are a part of the organization get to vote on a resolution. It takes literally a whole day to decide on the policy priorities of the organization. That is practicing democracy, ensuring that we are sharing our stories, right? We know that data is queen, but by sharing our stories, it actually makes it tangible and physical for our members of Congress to understand who they're fighting for. And we have to hold these state advocacy days, right? We have to, in the NAACP, we've been doing this across the country, ensuring that members are building back that advocacy muscle. At the beginning, I said that we were kind of getting lazy with some of the work that we were doing. We have to build that back and build it back even better, right? We have to ensure that we are bringing as many people to the table, that we are holding those forums, that we are synthesizing that information, and that we are consistently building towards a North Star.
At NWLC, similar to the other organizations here, I think, if you really want to be involved, just to follow our organizations, right? So many of us have lists that you can join. You can be on a mailing list. You can learn about opportunities to submit comments to the Trump administration, to comment on the changes around the gender markers for the passports from the State Department. We also drove comments with ACLU and other organizations. It's an easy way to go on our website, submit a comment, draft it the way you want to draft, or use form language. There will be other opportunities to weigh in on other policy actions from the Trump administration. There will be other opportunities to submit comments in response to proposed regulations because they are required by law to do that. And so if you follow our organizations, we're trusted sources on these issues, you can also easily access ways to be able to weigh in. We also share opportunities to contact your members of Congress. If there is a harmful piece of legislation, for example, that Congress is considering, we make it easy to be able to reach out and to understand what that legislation would do. It's if you're looking for an easy way to be involved, to engage on some of the actions that are happening federally, I think following our organizations is a start because we do provide the tools and the ways to be able to easily weigh in and to understand the issues that are, the ones that you are seeking to and hoping to engage on.
Did everyone get it? Yes.
I'll just add, building on everything everybody's already said. We've also been encouraging folks to educate themselves, learn everything they can, and then have those conversations not just with their friends and family, but in the workplace with their bosses and their city council, their school boards, going to their state legislature and saying, "This is what I see happening at the federal level, and these are the rights that I see being taken away. This is the funding I see being taken away, and how is that going to impact us where we are, and what are you going to do about it?" Because democracy, it's everybody's problem, and we all have to come up with the solutions. And I think it's getting people all around us and at every level to realize, we're all going to, if they're going to take away funding over there, then it's really going to be on us. And encouraging maybe state legislators to send a letter to Congress, to send a letter to the administration. And really, that's something that started with the fight for Medicaid, but it applies to every single fight we're having. That, I think, is just where we have to do.
I think the challenge becomes what we hear as members of Congress from our constituents is, well, what are you doing? And you talked about local victories. Many people don't feel the impact of their phone calls or their letters because they're not understanding that, this judge's order actually is a big deal in the whole scheme of things. So although it doesn't, halt the action, we're moving in the right direction. So I think that people are fatigued by not only everything that is coming at them, but the fact that it feels like we're losing on all fronts, and this incremental just bearing down upon them. and not feeling like anything is being done and all of their actions are in vain. So I guess, I mean, to everything that you say, how do we translate these local victories or these actions that may feel inconsequential in the larger scheme of things, but to, I guess, just reassure people that no, what you're doing is working, and we have to continue to do this, and you have to continue to show up, and this public sentiment and public pressure is the only way to move the needle, even if it feels like nothing is happening.
I can try to give an answer to that, but that's the struggle that we're in.
They're tired.
Yeah, they're tired, and
Tell me every day.
and
everybody's tired.
right, and we're not even at 100 days. So, I think part of the thing that I hold on to is having the long-term mindset and trying to talk to people about that their goal is to make us tired. The goal is to flood the zone, overwhelm us so that we cannot respond anymore and we give up. If we do stop holding on to the little victories, we will let them do that. And that this is a generational fight. And we need to be thinking about the long-term goal. And I think one of the things that, among others, that can be happening now is we can be building the record, documenting both what's happening, but also, building the legislative record in ways that will lay the groundwork for future legislation, for defending the programs that are under attack. That's a battle not on the scale of social media. We're not going to see a victory in the next 24 hours.
But there's almost an expectation that they're not going to follow the rules. They're not going to follow the law. And literally, when we're having conversations with people, they're like, yeah, okay, but the judge says this, but we expect that they won't follow. So it almost is like a crushing sense, amongst people who already feel marginalized, as if they are powerless in these spaces, to say that even the people that they perceive to have power are literally losing these battles. Please.
A couple of things. One, there were way too many Avengers movies. Like everybody thinks we're going to save the world in 2 hours. Yeah. But that being said, the first issue is the goal itself. Right now, the goal itself is to slow it down. One of my colleagues, much wiser than me, always says, make them earn every inch. And that's where, our congressional representatives really come into play, by not giving in ever on anything. And that's all I'll say about that. But you guys did that. Yeah, anything, nothing, because they wouldn't, right? And the difference is that the goal of slowing them down is to maintain the rule of law, is to maintain our civil rights. And so right now, the goal is not going to be the victories that we saw in 2020. We took to the streets, and in no time, people who never heard of Juneteenth were celebrating Juneteenth all of a sudden, right? And so that's not what's going to happen now. We're not going to get all of, corporations to put, $5 billion to Black female-owned businesses right now. Our goal is to hold the line and to not let them gain any more ground as they try to erode our rights. And if we can recalibrate that for folks, perhaps they can feel more accomplished when they do see that happening.
Let me ask a question along those lines. I get the sense from the Congresswoman's comment that they need reinforcements. And next year is going to be midterm elections. I haven't heard, I know you all are all nonprofits and you have your non-political sides, but I do think that a real important question for the fight that you're engaged in is getting people who can represent your views elected. And I haven't heard any conversation about the midterms coming up, being able to frame the messaging so that Representative Scott, the Congresswoman, can get reinforcements to combat what's going on, because as it stands now, they're outgunned in terms of voting.
You know, there's just always conversation when it comes to civic engagement about us starting too late, right? Folks start 3 months before an electoral cycle, before a presidential, before a midterm. Now, you know, folks are actually working to start early, right? There are organizations, including the NAACP, that are going on this the State of the People Power Tour, right? Part of that is making sure that we are starting that voter registration process early, that we are educating people, right? As folks are getting disgruntled and frustrated, we have to bring them along on that process with us. And Congressman Hayes, you're really great at this. I remember in 2020 when we were talking about the census, we did an IG Live with our youth and college members, and that brought so many people into that conversation in the midst of a global pandemic, right? And so what does it look like as we are seeing these things? I like the way I wrote down, make them earn every inch. I like to say we have to defend and protect, right? Every single thing we have to defend and protect. And as we're seeing that happen in real time, we are empowering voters. We are empowering members. We're empowering our constituency to say, hey, there's something that you can do about this. There's short-term and long-term goals, right? There's ways in which we can ensure that we are not eroding away everything that we've worked towards in the last administration. How are we working to build power? If the people who are in place who are voting on your behalf don't represent your belief, then run for something. Be a part of the system. Bring more people who may not feel empowered by what's happening on a federal level into the local and state, and then run for something.
Anyone else want to take the political question?
I would argue it's more policy than politics, because when people understand that the people making this policy that's negatively impacting your life, literally our first chance to shift the ground on that is in November of 2026, and that's the way I always frame it, because even a person, even the least political person, cares about what is happening right now.
Okay. I think we're at time. We were actually over time. So I want to thank all of our panelists. I really want to thank Congressman Scott for pulling this together. And I want to encourage you to continue to fight the good fight wherever you are, organizations or in Congress. Thank you.